I'm Aaron Ross Powell, and this is Reactionary Minds, a project of the unpopulist. Christian nationalism has long been a sub-movement on the American right, but recently its profile has risen as an increasing number of conservative media personalities and politicians claim the label and call for America to be reoriented as an explicitly Christian nation. To help me explore just what Christian nationalism entails as a movement and an ideology, as well as its history on the right, I'm joined today by Paul Matzko. He's a research fellow at the Cato Institute, an historian of the American right, and author of The Radio Right: How a Band of Broadcasters Took on the Federal Government and Built the Modern Conservative Movement. Let's start by unpacking the term Christian nationalism. What in this context do we mean by Christian?
So this is a definitional issue, right? So if you ask someone, if you say someone's a Christian nationalist, most of the time they're going to say, well, no, I don't think I am, because the term is kind of loaded. It's a bit of a loaded term. So it's important that we define what we mean when we discuss it, how people who are self-identified Christian nationalists, what they mean by using the term, what folks who we would say espouse Christian nationalist views, even though they wouldn't call themselves Christian nationalists, mean by the term. The funny thing about Christian nationalism, the two terms there, it's a bit like the old saw about the Holy Roman Empire being neither holy nor Roman nor much of an empire. Christian nationalism is neither particularly Christian in terms of its, I guess you'd say, fidelity to historic Christian orthodoxy, nor is it all that effectively nationalist when it comes down to it. It's this, I think of it as a response to a particular moment in American history, but it is a response to this moment by anxious Christians that echoes previous moments in U.S. history when previous generations of Christians have espoused similar views, just kind of cloaked in different language with different targets for their anxiety. So it's both new in the sense that it reflects this particular moment, but also very old, in that you can find strains of what I guess today we would call Christian nationalism, though it's a relatively recent term, all the way back through American history.
What is this moment then?
Yeah, so the way I'd put it is this: like, if you were our age, right? You're Gen X, I'm millennial. If you're our age, you remember the 90s, right? We're children or teens of the 90s. And we are coming off a period of peak conservative Christian dominance in American culture. Now, not in every American cultural institution. The 90s were not peak Christian influence on the Supreme Court. Arguably, that's right now, which a majority of the members of the Supreme Court are conservative Christians of some kind or another. Nor necessarily dominance in politics. I would argue that the early 2000s were kind of the peak moment of new Christian right influence in American politics during the Bush administration. But in terms of just kind of cultural majoritarian influence, the 90s were kind of it. It's post fall of the Berlin Wall. It felt like godless communism had been defeated by American Christianity. In fact, if you go to the Billy Graham Museum in North Carolina, there's a chunk of the Berlin Wall as one of the exhibits. And the idea being that, like, Billy Graham went and preached in Berlin and the wall fell, right? So it was a triumph of American evangelicalism over godless communism. And we get, like, if you walked into a strip mall or a mall in the 90s, odds are you'd walk by one of the 4,500 Thomas Kincaid, the Christian artist, the painter of light, one of his studios. You'd hear acoustic contemporary Christian music playing on the mall speakers. It was like literally in the air, an oral permeation of the American landscape. I grew up, there was a Christian bookstore in every town of any size all across America. Kind of like, think of like Borders, but with more like devotional literature. So the 90s are this period of kind of peak conservative Christian, both conservative Catholic and conservative evangelical influence in American culture. And since then, that dominance really has been gradually eroding. The rise of the nuns, of people who don't identify as Christian, the rise of the way that evangelicals themselves would have described it would have been a secular humanism, people who don't believe in God and are kind of it's kind of a figment, a paranoid figment of the imagination in part. But there has been this rise of kind of secular, a-religious folks in America over the last 20 years. There are now more nuns than there are Catholics. Nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S. So the American religious landscape has changed in significant ways. And so you go from that period of kind of cultural dominance to slipping significance. And that creates status anxiety. So I think the key to note is that episodes of Christian nationalism in American history, and I can tell you more about the long history of this, tend to correspond with feelings of anxiety and are ultimately rooted in cultural fear that some status or place or significance is being lost and might never return. And that tends to fuel, it ultimately tends to fuel kind of paranoid political activism, which is what we're kind of seeing right now, in which we are labeling Christian nationalism.
How does Trump fit into that then? And this goes back, I think, to my initial question of what we mean by Christian, because one of the odd things that we've seen is an embrace of a man who arguably does not embody Christian values.
Yes.
Like seems to be kind of the consummate sinner, right? And doesn't seem to know anything about, I mean, when I grew up, there were always these television preachers you'd flip across when kind of the Saturday morning cartoons had ended and you're still just didn't want to get up from the TV and you're flipping channels and there'd be these guys. And one of their characteristics was, as bizarre as they were, they had basically memorized the Bible and could quote all these things. Trump doesn't have that either. Like he doesn't know anything, and his values run very counter to my understanding of the values Christ stood for. And yet he's embraced, which seems like this weird response to a lack of influence. Because if what you're imagining is happening is that Christian values are no longer central to American life, but now you're embracing as the guy who's going to represent you and bringing them back, someone who is even more in opposition to Christian values than most of those nuns or secular humanists seem to be.
Yeah. Well, it's true. I mean, there is an irony or hypocrisy, I suppose, depending on how you view it there. And that is one of the reasons why quite a few, maybe I should put, hashtag not all Christians or not all evangelicals or not all conservative Christians, because there are significant numbers who were anti-Trump for precisely the reasons you mentioned. They said, look, this is, a twice divorced, notorious liar and grifter is not a fitting representative of kind of Christian interests in politics. But they were the minority opinion. I mean, after all, in the end of the day, about 80% of self-described evangelicals voted for Donald Trump in 2016 and similar number in 2020. So it's definitely the minority opinion. As far as why it makes sense, though, despite that difference, is again, I think you have to see this as rooted in fear. And when you're afraid, there is little you wouldn't do. The way this gets justified, and so I don't want to overemphasize the justifications for it, because I suspect that even if these justifications weren't invented, other justifications would have been invented, right? These are kind of ex post facto. How do we justify the results that we wanted? But there are kind of two responses. One, and we can talk more about Seven Mountains theology in more detail. There's kind of a Pentecostal variant theology, which is obsessed with capturing the seven mountains of cultural influence in America, one of which is government. And in that framing, and from that kind of community, there was this idea that Trump represented the symbolic rebirth, almost to use Christian terminology, almost like a Christ type um, rebirth of Cyrus, King Cyrus of the Persian Empire. And for those who didn't grow up learning about King Cyrus in Sunday school, well, good for you, I suppose. But Cyrus is the king of Persia when the exilic Jews who have been captured and forced into captivity for generations, he says you can go back to Jerusalem. You can go back to to Israel and rebuild Jerusalem. So it's a big deal in terms of prophetic passages of scripture. Cyrus plays this big role in that he kind of frees the people of Israel, notably despite not being Jewish, obviously, and not being a kind of a believer, if you will. So the idea that a secular king who doesn't share the values of God's people would still look out for the interests and safety and protection of God's people is a kind of a type. It's a literary type in kind of Christian thinking. That's not exclusive just to the current Christian nationalists. So they kind of seized on the idea and explicitly in this Seven Mountains community said Trump is our new Cyrus. So the fact that he is an unbeliever or a marginal believer, I don't know what you want to, and that he has all these personal problems and so on, doesn't really matter in the same sense that Cyrus had a harem. He had lots of wives. Who really cares? What matters is that he protects God's people. He's kind of God's ordained secular workman on our behalf. And so there was a way of kind of sacralizing that impulse. Others got less fancy with the theological trappings, and like Robert Jeffress, who's the pastor of Dallas, of First Baptist in Dallas, large Southern Baptist megachurch in Texas. He basically just said, look, we're a standard line. We're voting for a president, not for a pastor. And at the end of the day, we want the bully who looks out for us to fight off the bullies who are against us. So better Donald Trump than Hillary Clinton. So there was lots of different ways of just saying, the lesser of two evils, of saying, all the way to kind of oddly reading him into the scripture as a new Cyrus. So a range of responses, all of which at the end of the day, I think is rooted just in fear. Fear that if Donald Trump doesn't win in 2016, isn't reelected in 2020, that it's the end of American Christianity as we know it, that the godless humanists and feminists and civil rights activists and, are going to swamp America and destroy what makes us great. So, yeah.
When you hear Christian nationalists or other people who are coming from a place of these same shared concerns talk about that fear, there's often something a little odd going on that maybe you can tease out for me, which is they speak as if people are secular humanists or non-Christians or the elites are trying to actively destroy their religious beliefs, stamp it out, or that there's like an aggressive attack upon them and their beliefs. So this is the, like, you can no longer say Merry Christmas, or, is one version of that.
The war on Christmas.
Right. But then when they point to examples of what's wrong in America, or when they lash out or they try to get the law changed, it's not so much defensive in the sense of there are people trying to force us to bake cakes for gay weddings or whatever, but it is more they're lashing out at growing tolerance for lifestyles that they object to. And so it's not so much that what they're pointing to are direct assaults on their ability to believe the things that they want to believe, but rather that other people are being allowed to believe something different. And those aren't quite the same thing, but they talk about them as if they are.
Yeah, there's the core irony that conservative American Christians are not just the least persecuted religious community in the world today, they're arguably the least actually persecuted religious community in all of human history. So it's a bizarre juxtaposition, and yet, if you go and ask, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but I think Barna, a religious pollster, or maybe it was Pew, did a poll asking who are the most persecuted communities in America. And they went and asked a bunch of different Americans. And so if you ask African Americans, they'll usually say African Americans, and for good reason, right? History of racism, segregation, and so on. But if you ask Christians, they will say that they are the most persecuted religious group in America, more so than Muslims, more so than Jews facing anti-Semitism, which is just ludicrous. So the question is, what's going on there? Why do they feel so persecuted? And I actually think it's sincere. Not that makes it accurate, but it's a sincere belief. And the sincerity, I think, is rooted in a variety of habits and kind of cultural practices, rituals, even, if you will. So growing up evangelical, and I would still identify as evangelical myself today, but growing up a very conservative evangelical community, you were steeped in a lot of storytelling about persecution, about the constant, imminent, just beyond the veil threat of persecution. Just the shoe is always about to drop. And that ranges from, when I was a kid, and this is a reminder that this habit is very old. I read, as young as 5 or 6, I read and had portions read to me from Fox's Book of Martyrs, which was a Protestant book that was a from the Reformation era. Like, we're talking 16th, 17th century European wars of religion, which was like, look at all the Catholics killing and crucifying. It was also people from early Christian history being persecuted by the Romans, thrown to the lions, and so on. So, like, literally some of the earliest kind of cradle instruction I received was the world's out to get and kill Christians. And the fact that it's not happening now shouldn't make you don't get blasé about that. It's always just around the corner. So that mindset is kind of taught. And it also, I think, is a function of and rather I don't want to poo-poo all of that as nothing. One of the funny things about conservative Christianity in America is that it is at least in the 90s, less so today, it was the peak of an era when it was kind of cultural majoritarian, and yet it felt like they felt like an oppressed minority. Some of that was a memory of an era when they actually were a weird, relatively small, culturally insignificant group. So, like, you go back to the 1920s, and Christians are the laughingstock in the stories that are told about the Scopes trial, right? And creationism on trial, William Jennings Bryan, John T. Scopes, and so on. Or you go to the era of the 1940s and 50s, when mainline Christianity, liberal ecumenical, liberal Protestantism is far more dominant and actually possesses real political power. Like the Dulles brothers are mainline Christians with lots of behind the scenes power in DC. All the presidents, Eisenhower, Truman, they all attend mainline churches. And so conservative Christians remember a time when they don't control much. There might be a lot of them out in the boondocks, out in rural Tennessee, but they don't hold real power in American politics until suddenly they do by the 1980s and 90s. And so it's kind of a mindset that's forged in a moment when they do remember being kind of on the margins of American society, and suddenly they aren't anymore, but they can't escape that mindset. So it's a combination of that. It's kind of a taught mindset. It's a taught attitude. And then also, I think it's rooted in a real experience of being on the relative margins of American political power and society, and the fear of returning to that situation too, right? That's where the status anxiety comes in.
You mentioned in passing some of the theological through lines or influences on this. So I want to turn to that because there are people out there who call themselves, say, Christian nationalists. So Marjorie Taylor Greene has been increasingly using that phrase and saying, like, you're damn right I am, and this is what we need. But she doesn't seem, it's hard to say figure out a theological through line for her because she's got Christian influences, but also a lot of QAnon, and then there's the Jewish space lasers stuff, and so she seems to just be a hodgepodge. But is there like a core thinker or set of thinkers that is the primary driver or influence on this particular emergence now?
Yeah, so there are varieties of Christian nationalism coming out of different particular religious communities and milieus. The one that's most notable now, and I already kind of referenced it with Seven Mountains theology, Seven Mountains mandate, it's sometimes called. That's the main influence behind people like Paula White, who prayed at Trump's inauguration. Her prayer said, "For this great country that you have decreed to your people," which is as clear an expression of Christian nationalism, that God gave this nation to Christians. Right? If that's not Christian nationalism, what is? Lance Wallnau, actually Charlie Kirk, your buddy Aaron, he got in on this game at CPAC in 2020. He said that with Trump, quote, "Finally, we have a president that understands the seven mountains of cultural influence." Rafael Cruz, Ted Cruz's father, is a big proponent of Seven Mountains theology. He played a role in actually Ted Cruz's success in the Utah GOP primaries in 2016. He actually went on to stump for his son, because Mormons are an interesting kind of Christian nationalism, which that's a kind of a separate discussion. But this Seven Mountains theology, I don't want to get too much down in the weeds. Again, it's I tend to think of it as an ex post facto justification for a more basic impulse to be concerned about the direction of America and your community's place in America. And then you go back and you kind of backfill theologically. But the theological groundings are these verses in Isaiah and Revelation about seven mountains. They're pretty obscure prophetic passages, but the meaning that they're given is that these seven mountains described represent seven centers of cultural power in America, things like education, family, government, arts, the media, and so on. And if Christians don't conquer those mountains, the high places first, then the forces of Satan will, ushering in the Antichrist and the end times. So it is a novel interpretation of these passages. It comes out of independent charismatic Christian circles, technically called the New Apostolic Reformation. So if you're in your area, if there's a mega church that's run not by a pastor or a preacher, and it's not part of a denomination, like a more established Pentecostal denomination like the Assemblies of God or so on, but it's like an independent mega church with an apostle leading it. They say, "I'm Apostle Ron Carpenter," or that the odds are pretty decent that's kind of part of these independent charismatic circles. And they're the ones who, again, part of that interpretation are like, look, Trump is a fulfillment of prophecies around Cyrus. He's a new Cyrus. And when when Trump moved the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, that confirmed in their minds, look, that's just like Cyrus sending God's people back to rebuild Jerusalem. Now Trump is sending, in the same way the U.S. embassy represents the return of exilic Jews somehow. I don't know, but the symbolism was very apparent to them. So, it's a combination of, I think, sincere belief, but then also there's a good amount of grift going on here. So like Lance Wallnau, one of the kind of main proponents, the source of Seven Mountains theology, he prophesied Trump's election in 2016. So he got a lot of street cred. He prophesied the election and before it was cool to think Trump was going to win, back when Trump was a marginal candidate. And then he wins, and it's like, well, obviously that was a true prophecy, ergo have a high opinion of my views. He did miss the prediction in 2020. He said Trump would win re-election, though not before selling a bunch of $45 Trump. It's like Trump's image superimposed on Cyrus's image on gold coins, which he hawked on Jim Bakker's cable show. You might remember Jim Bakker is the disgraced televangelist from the 1980s. It's basically like a sanctified QVC ripoff for end times preppers in the Ozarks. He's actually now, Lance Wallnau's on the campaign trail for Doug Mastriano running for governor in Pennsylvania. So, I mean, you just go down the list of figures in the Trump administration. Michael Flynn, he went to John Hagee, his mega church, and said, quote, if we are going to have one nation under God, which we must, we have to have one religion, one nation under God, and one religion under God. So like it's pervasive in kind of ex-Trump administration officials of a certain type. It is pervasive in right-wing politics right now. I mean, Charlie Kirk is traveling America on these pulpit and pew rallies, is what they've been described as, going to mega churches, often kind of Seven Mountains independent charismatic churches, and holding pro-Trump rallies and saying, look, the key to saving America is doing get out the vote work among conservative Christians. So this Seven Mountains thing, it's I think most American observers have never even heard of this. It's kind of an obscure theological interpretation, relatively novel, relatively recent, that even most conservative Christians haven't necessarily heard of, but it's actually very pervasive and throughout right-wing politics in America today.
Let's then turn specifically to the nationalism part of this, and then specifically within that, American nationalism. That because you could kind of be indifferent to America per se and just have your view be that this geographical area with a state that governs it, I want it to be Christian. But there does seem to be something more to the connection than that, they see something particularly special about America or America's relationship to Christianity. So how does that play out in this?
So here's where we get we get to that older kind of impulse and among American Christians, and not even just conservative Christians. I mean, I've been speaking about conservative Catholics, evangelicals right now, but this is a very old and kind of cross theological impulse in American history. This idea of identifying America as a special place in God's divine order for human history. There's actually a technical term for this. So in classic Christian theology, both Catholic and Protestant, it's not universal, but it's kind of the consensus opinion, is this proposition. You ever wonder about the difference between, Jewish theology and Christian theology? Well, one of the keys is that Christians believe that Jews were sent a Messiah. The promised Messiah came, Jesus Christ. Jews rejected him. Therefore, they're no longer God's chosen people. Now, the church of Christians are God's chosen people. We call this, the technical theological term is supersessionism or replacement theology, that the church replaces Israel as God's people. Not fully, and this is where you get into like Christian Zionism, like the weird philo-Semitism, where American evangelicals are like, yay, the state of Israel. But that set aside, formally, theologically, the standard Christian interpretation has been that the people of God today are the Christian church writ large, not just one denomination, but all Christians. There is but there's a habit, if you will, throughout Christian history. It's not just an American impulse, it's a broader impulse, that anytime a country is particularly successful or powerful or wealthy, there's this habit of Christians in that country to be like, well, obviously God has blessed this nation because we're doing so well. We're doing like gangbusters. Therefore, we must be kind of God's new chosen people. So, in the era of Pax Britannica, this combination of the British are going to not just civilize primitive peoples, they're going to Christianize them. So cross and flag were carried together during high British imperialism. And the same thing happens with the rise of Pax Americana. I think here of during the Spanish-American War, a group of liberal Protestants. These are mainline Protestants. It's kind of before that term is used, but these were not just evangelicals. It was a broad cross section of prominent pastors in the U.S. got together and told President McKinley, like, the U.S. has a sacred obligation to Christianize and civilize the Philippines. So you should keep it as a colony so that you can get these people away from the darkness of pagan traditions and, of course, the darkness of Catholicism. This is peak anti-Catholicism in U.S. history. So by Christianize, they mean Protestantize. So there you very literally see America. God has blessed America so that America, as God's people, can spread the blessings of civilization, Christianity, to the world. More recently, you think of in the post-World War II era, the CIA. We know some of this came out during the post-Watergate congressional hearings, but we know that the CIA was actively recruiting and working with American missionaries abroad in the 1940s and 50s, kind of using them as agents for protecting American empire, even as they were seeking to ostensibly merely Christianize, propagate the gospel in these other countries. So that impulse is broad. It's not just conservatives, not just evangelicals. It's a function of when Christians have power, they tend to forget all the passages of the Bible that are to God's people when they were in exile, when they are persecuted, when they're a minority. They forget all that stuff. And instead, they like to read the bits that are more amenable to holding, possessing, and advancing cultural and political power. So that kind of imperial impulse or Christian nationalist impulse, seeing instead of the church replacing Israel, seeing the nation state as kind of a replacement for Israel, tends to creep into Christian thinking in those moments in time.
We've been talking about Christian nationalism, but the phrase is often written out in, say, newspaper articles about the rise of this as white Christian nationalism. What role then does race play in this conversation and the particular wave we're seeing now?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things about in America, America is exceptional in the sense that we have this very unique view of race. We have our own exceptional form of racism. In other countries, this is an old point. But other countries have like if you go to South America, there is still racism, though it looks more like colorism, where gradations of skin color infer certain kinds of social status. But kind of a hard racial white and black line is more uniquely American. So race tends to creep into every conversation in American history and culture and politics, just by default. So it applies here too, though. One of the interesting things, though, so to some extent, when I talk about Seven Mountains theology, most of the believers and practitioners of this theology are white. Some of that's just a function of fissures in American Christianity going all the way back to the early 20th century to the 19th century, where basically almost every American denomination split over racism and over slavery. So you have Southern Baptists, which were expressly formed in defense of the rights of Baptists to hold slaves in the South, versus Northern Baptists who said you shouldn't. And you just go down the list. And so some of that is a function of the very kind of the fissures in American Christian groups that are very old and continue today. But I think some of it too, though, it's important to remember that there are different forms of Christian nationalism, and that just because the current one that's dominant kind of right now in right-wing politics happens to be very white, doesn't mean that all forms of Christian nationalism are white. And I would argue that, there are somewhat diluted but still very real forms of Christian nationalism that it's hard to find anyone who doesn't believe in them, except for maybe weird libertarians like us and I guess socialists who don't believe in the Christian part. There is so think of it this way: every time a politician says America is a shining city on a hill, and almost every American president of the last half century has at some point in time or another referenced America as a city on a hill. That's an expression of Christian nationalism. It's taking a Bible verse meant to talk about God's people, the Jews, and Jerusalem as a city on the hill, a beacon to the nations, and applying it to America. You don't get more Christian nationalism than that, and yet it is anodyne. Everyone references it. And my point here too is that then people kind of use Christian nationalism as a tool to gain cultural acceptance. So there are kind of black Christian nationalisms, which identify, look, God had a plan for America. That plan was included racial equality among Christians, in America, and yet we have fallen away from God's plan for America, promised at the founding. And we need it's kind of a Jeremiah here. We've fallen away from this state of grace, and now we need to return to that. Part of that is, in the church, then black church being deeply involved in civil rights activism. That is a claim on we belong. We believe we deserve political equality because this is a Christian nation, and in that Christian nation, should be a land of racial equality. So asserting Christian nationalism can be a tool for claiming belonging and place. And so that's why I would note is that, yes, that this version that we're talking about here, Seven Mountains theology, that is very white inflected, and it tends to be hostile towards black, brown, others by default. So it tends to be very anti-immigrant, suspicious of immigration, certainly suspicious of, I don't know, things like critical race theory and so on. But that's not the only form of Christian nationalism that exists. So that's kind of the caution I would put when having that conversation.
Now, as liberals who are against this sort of thing, namely the the takeover of the state and the operationalizing of it as a means to enforce a particular set of religious beliefs across the nation itself. What's the response to this? Because there's one set of responses, right? If you're simply like a non-Christian, so there's the religious pluralism response of, hey, I don't share your metaphysical priors, and so am not comfortable with them being enforced upon me. But there's also going to be a liberal Christian response, and so what is the liberal Christian response to this, and how do you begin to push back on the idea that, because it makes sense to say, like, if you are a member of a evangelical faith, like, your Christianity goes out and spreads the good news, right? Like, it's a religion that wants to convert people, and get them to live in accord with, that conversion means having them live in accord with Christian beliefs and values. And then you've got this tool called the government. You don't want that government to operate in ways that go against Christian values, but it's also a powerful tool for getting a lot of people to, if not embrace those, at least live in ways that don't contradict them. And so what's the liberal Christian case against Christian nationalism?
Yeah, that's a good question. It maybe just for my listeners who are your listeners who are, who use these terms. So if you say liberal Christian, it doesn't mean what you mean. So by liberal Christian, you mean like classical liberal, kind of libertarian-ish Christian. If you say liberal Christian to a Christian, they think of liberal, like usually liberal Protestantism or post-Vatican II Catholicism. They think of liberal theology, which is so kind of classically liberal. How do I think about Christianity and as an evangelical and as a libertarian? It's a good question. So the way I would put it is, and this is actually a very libertarian point. We are, as a libertarian, we see time and time again, you observe the incompetence of the state at accomplishing its self-set goals. Like, here's the outcome we want. The state tries to do it and it bungles it. And we not only don't get the outcome we want, we get the opposite of the outcome we want. So the inadequacy of state capacity, its inefficiency, its ability to provoke backlash rather than achieve the results at once, that plays a role here. So you just say, look, if your goal is to have the state advance Christianity, can we historically look at how good the state is at advancing Christianity? And the answer is, it's terrible at it. So just in pragmatic terms, the state is a terrible organ for advancing Christianity. And by Christianity, I mean true Christianity. I don't just mean the external form of it. And this is kind of a marker of evangelicalism, is this belief that religion is a heart religion. It's about personal affirmation and a relationship with Jesus Christ. That's not all religious traditions share that, but true Christianity then is this authentic internal relationship with a divine being. The state is horrible at advancing that. All it can really do is impose the external form of Christianity. And the long history of both European and early American established state churches is a great example of that. A great way of killing authentic heart religion is for the state to create a religion or to back a particular religious group. So you look at the hollowing out of Christianity in places like Great Britain, where Christianity is on life support, even though it's the state church and the Queen is the head of the Church of England, or the official established churches in Germany, where so this, and in U.S. history, we had these arguments during the early years in the early Republic, but also during the founding era. Should there be state religions in the U.S.? And of course, in the U.S. Constitution, they didn't put a state religion, but individual states still had established churches, still had state religions as late as I think the 1830s. I think Massachusetts was the last. But again, what they discovered time and again, and this was a point made by evangelical Americans like John Leland and Isaac Backus. They said, look, state churches are antithetical. They actively undermine authentic religion because it just creates a form thereof, an external form, and hollows out the internal meaning. So there's an efficacy concern, a pragmatic, but maybe if the state was good at advancing religion, it'd be okay, but it's not. Okay, so there's that. There's also then, I think, a theological critique. I don't want to get too down in the weeds here, but there are many Bible passages which deal with the issue of the state and with force. There's a great book by Oscar Coleman called The State in the New Testament. Which I just highly recommend reading sometime. It shows the tension between the Jesus and his disciples and the idea of the state during early Christianity. But you look at passages like, think of Christ right before his crucifixion. He's in the garden. He's praying. He doesn't want to be crucified. Crucifixion sucks. He then, representatives of the authorities, of the Jewish authorities working, I guess, under ultimate Roman command, come in to arrest him. And Peter jumps up, ultimately the first pope in theory. Peter jumps up and is like, okay, I know what to do when this happens. We're being attacked. They want to kill the Messiah. Pick up that sword and whack a soldier's ear off. So he whacks the soldier's ear off, and Christ is like, Peter, come on, Peter. This is not the way we do things. And he heals the soldier. He puts the ear back on the soldier, and Peter's like, what? This is what you do. That's what the swords are for. Like, and so we talk about this as laying down the sword. And Christ says, ultimately there's this idea that my kingdom is not of this world, and that the sword is not an effective tool for advancing the kingdom of God. This metaphysical community of saints on earth, the kingdom of God, that someday in Christian theology and Christian eschatology will become a literal kingdom of God during end times events, but now it's just kind of a metaphorical kingdom of God on earth, is not to be advanced by the sword. That's just not how you do it. It doesn't work. It's not effective. It's not proper. It's not right. And so if you believe, as a libertarian does, that the sword ultimately is representative of institutionalized violence, and what the state has is a monopoly on violence, then Christ's command to lay down the sword, to expand the kingdom of God via voluntary interaction, via persuasion, not by violence, is essentially a prohibition on using the state to extend Christianity. So there's a pragmatic reason to be critical of Christian nationalist fantasies, and there's a theological reason why conservative Christians should be skeptical. And I could get real down in the weeds. There's these old Christian traditions, like two kingdom theology. It can go all the way back to Augustine. This has been a long tension going, to the Constantinian versus Augustinian vision of the role of the state in the advance of Christianity. But I think there are very good reasons for sincere conservative Christians to say, look, this is not the way to advance our faith, to propagate our religion, to evangelize, both because it's wrong, because Christ condemns it, and because it doesn't work. The state is bad at it.
Thank you for listening to Reactionary Minds, a project of the Unpopulist. If you want to learn more about the rise of illiberalism and the need to defend a free society, check out theunpopulist.substack.com.